All right. Fixed the problem. Turned out it actually wasn't my mic at all. It turns out, even though there were some settings that I wanted to tweak with, it was the internet speed. Internet speed once again dropped next to nothing once the stream began, even though I had been doing tests literally all day to make sure that the upload speed was good enough for YouTube. It just decided to drop the moment I went live. Seems to be stable right now, so away we go. Anyways, with all that said, welcome everybody. The few of you that are here, hopefully more will populate. I also updated all the links to the new stuff, so hopefully they'll start clinking it. But hello, everyone. I'm Adam Noyce. I am the owner of AN Productions. AN Productions is a channel for military history, film history, and history in general. I welcome all of you to the ANP annual Halloween live stream. This is this month, or this year's one. Welcome to 2025, Adam. Way to wake up. As it is Spook Month, I wanted to do something kind of horror related, you see. And I've kind of hinted at it before, but, you know, let's just make it official here. I love Hammer horror. In fact, my hot take is that not only do I prefer Hammer horror to Universal horror, but I think it is universally better. Oh my god, I just realized I made a pun. I totally didn't mean to, but I just made a pun. So, do forgive me if now you have cancer. But while I personally grew up with Hammer's Dracula series, I had seen a couple of their Frankenstein movies while I was very young. It wasn't until about a decade ago that I actually truly started my deep dive into Hammer in general and discovered just how wonderful their Frankenstein movies really are. I pressed wrong. There we go. Huh. Ah, that's why. We'll get this working. There it is. We'll get it working eventually, right? Right. Anyways, I love the Hammer Frankenstein series. It's actually to the point that I would argue that Hammer's Frankenstein series is the best horror series of all time. I know that that is also, you know, a hot take, but here we are. Here we are. Now, what do I mean by Hammer's Frankenstein series? Because there's 7 films. There's 7 films in the series. Well, in the context for tonight's stream, I am referring to the films in which Peter Cushing stars as Baron Victor Frankenstein. So, Horror of Frankenstein technically should fall in this list. However, it is so tonally different from all the others, while also not having Peter Cushing in it, I've decided to exclude it. Honestly, it's not a very good movie, but it almost deserves its own discussion because of its fascinating place within film history and Hammer history, but that's not for tonight. So what exactly am I actually talking about? Well, tonight I am giving a brief retrospective in history of Hammer's Frankenstein series starring Peter Cushing. These films are in order: Curse of Frankenstein, Revenge for Frankenstein, or Revenge of Frankenstein, The Evil of Frankenstein, Frankenstein Created Woman, and Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, and Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. Now, at Hammer, there are 3 really big film series in terms of their horror that delve into gothic horror in specifically. There is Dracula, there is The Mummy, and then there is Frankenstein. There are 9 Dracula films of varying results. There are 4 excellent Mummy films, and there are 7 entertaining Frankenstein films. Dracula is all over the place, right? The Dracula series is all over the place and suffers heavily from telling basically the same story over and over and over and over and over again. How much can you actually do with just Dracula, right? There's only so much you can do with that character, which was a problem that was echoed from Universal with their Frankenstein monster. A very similar situation. Now, ironically, that same problem is actually what escalated Hammer's Mummy series into wonderful movies, because while they were telling each film was telling its own story, and basically the same story, literally all of them, but the style was so radically different, making each not just some of Hammer's most gorgeous-looking movies, but some of their most interesting. And then there's Frankenstein. Now, unlike Dracula or The Mummy, Frankenstein benefits from an overall consistent tone and look. This is very important. And I think this largely comes about largely because of the creative directorial eye of one Terence Fisher, who is also one of my personal favorite directors, if not my favorite director of all time. Because out of the 7 Frankenstein films, he would direct 5. And one of those movies in which he didn't direct, we're actually not even going to talk about tonight. So he directed a vast majority of the movies we are discussing tonight, and thus a vast majority of the Frankenstein movies. But Frankenstein just simply does not fall into the same trap Hammer's Dracula did, or even the Frankenstein movies from Universal Studios. And the reason for this truly stems from both a creative decision and an economic one. All right, instead of focusing on the monster, Hammer would focus on Victor Frankenstein himself. Now, what does this do? Well, creatively, this opens the door wide open for different experiments and different adventures Victor Frankenstein can partake. This is something writers of this series would take great advantage of. Hell, 3 of the Frankenstein movies that we're discussing don't even have a monster in it per se. One of them being, to me, an utter cult classic. As far as economics go, that is because when Universal Studios learned Hammer was looking to make an adaptation, quote unquote, for Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's novel, they threatened not just to sue, but to utterly destroy Hammer Studios if they attempted to include anything resembling their Frankenstein. So what does that mean? The biggest one being no green flat-headed monsters. None of that. Now, Terence Fisher was a genius. Terence Fisher would claim that this actually worked in his favor. He didn't even bother rewatching the original 1931 Frankenstein in preparation for this movie, or for the first film, I should say. Ultimately, that was a great decision, in my opinion, seeing as Curse of Frankenstein is an adaptation of Mary Shelley's novel, in that they share the name Frankenstein, and that's just about it. Even more so than Universal, Hammer took the bare-bones idea of a mad scientist creating a monster and just did their own thing with it. Which, while, rubbing some diehards of fans of the novel the wrong way, to me, it freed Hammer to truly make something iconic for themselves. Moving on. So, speaking of consistency, as I did earlier, the lead is played by Peter Cushing himself. He became the face of Frankenstein. And it is these movies, I think, that truly made Cushing an icon of horror. Never once does this man disappoint in any of these movies. He is playing the character as serious and as cold as ever, yet never losing this odd charm and this true, almost Shakespearean quality that keeps audiences coming back time and time and time again, and why he has so many fans today. Now, having Peter Cushing as Frankenstein kept a familiar face through all the films in which he's in within the series. Hammer would not repeat the same mistakes of Universal in having us confused as to who Frankenstein was. Was it the doctor or was it the monster? Or even the ever-changing face of Henry Frankenstein or his sons and his daughter. No, it's Peter Cushing. It's Peter Cushing and Peter Cushing alone for the sake of tonight's live stream. And yes, I am aware of Ralph Bates in Horror of Frankenstein, but we're not discussing that tonight. And I say all this to rotate back to my initial sentiment for Hammer's Frankenstein. you have the same director of 5 of 7 of your films, right? And the same leading man for 6 of them. The formula makes for a very consistent series that truly feels tied together, and overall telling a continuing story of the Baron. Now, Peter Cushing would embrace the role of Victor Frankenstein with his usual professionalism and gusto. And to kind of show you this and how he looked at the role, I actually wish to read a quote here, though I'm not sure if he said this while he was playing Frankenstein or after. But here's what he said. He said, quote, "Very few people want to see me play Hamlet. However, millions want to see me play Frankenstein. So I play Frankenstein." Well, that sums it up, doesn't it? That sums up most of it. Now, unlike Christopher Lee, his counterpart here at Hammer, who was unbelievably reluctant to embrace his position as a horror icon, Cushing falls into a category similar to that of Vincent Price. Both men reveled in the fame their roles brought them, and not just understood their position as a horror as horror royalty, essentially, but they embraced it, completely embraced it. And both proved to also have a magnificent sense of humor. They are truly funny people to listen to in interviews and stuff. Now, I mentioned this. They also understood it and they respected it. And to kind of prove this, I mentioned Peter Cushing's cameo in the film Top Secret, the Zucker Brothers movie, spoofing one of the most famous shots from any of the Frankenstein films, in which the Baron Frankenstein is seen looking through a magnifying glass and it makes his eye look giant. One of the most famous shots in cinema history, in my humble opinion. Now, some directors, I'd imagine, would hate working with somebody like Peter Cushing, who was always so protective of whichever characters that he played. But not Terence Fisher. Oh, I jumped ahead of my notes. Forgive me. Let me bounce back a little bit. It's almost comical to look at copies of Peter Cushing scripts, because if you look at them, they are marked all to hell, with changes, revisions, suggestions, stage directions, and even the name of his beloved wife, which we'll get into that a little bit later. It almost served as a good luck charm for him for a very long time, and that's because Cushing gave a shit. Cushing gave a shit about what he did. It didn't matter what role. He was a true professional actor. And much of what we associate with the character of Victor Frankenstein actually didn't come from the writers of the film, but Cushing himself. The way Frankenstein, those mannerisms, most notably the Cushing finger, just almost in every single role that he does. That sly smile, the movement of his eyes, the way Frankenstein will fiddle with and clean his lab equipment while he's talking with somebody. One scene, he's flipping through a Bible like he's analyzing it while he's giving a testimony. The way he doesn't, look at his assistants very much. He's always doing something. He's always carrying himself with an arrogance, a higher than thou attitude. And all of that is really Peter Cushing. And some directors, to circle back to my mistake, I would imagine that they would not like working with somebody like Peter Cushing, who was always so protective of his characters. But not Terence Fisher. Out of all the people to direct Peter Cushing, I truly believe Terence Fisher was the best man to just unleash Cushing and foment a perfect performance. Now, why is this? Largely because of Fisher's style. He wasn't a flashy director, certainly no auteur by any means, but a competent, I can't even say that that's the right word, I would say an outstanding director, nevertheless. He kind of reminds me of a Clint Eastwood. Not so much in style, but directorial style. That is, how he directs people. Fisher was very relaxed, very open to suggestions and stuff like that. He didn't like to do many takes. He liked to keep it short and simple. Even if the budget allowed him to do multiple takes, he just wouldn't. He was very quick. He was very efficient. And he was usually staging things out in wides and medium shots instead of more creative close-ups to sort of emphasize razzmatazz and stuff, like some directors would, such as Sergio Leone. And it is this style that, to me, allows for some amazing blocking, which provided significant room for the actors in this case, namely Peter Cushing, to truly thrive. It's also what makes Fisher one of the best directors of horror and a titan of the genre itself. This is the separating factor between Fisher and another director making same quality films within a similar genre. That's Ishiro Honda over in Japan. Both were undisputed kings in their fields. Horror for Fisher, science fiction and kaiju for Ishiro Honda, making movies with similar looks and similar qualities for studios that reveled in the success of these genre pictures. While Honda was very controlling over everything, he liked to directly block everybody, and he would directly tell people how to act, and very rarely did he deviate from the scripts he was assigned. Fisher did the complete opposite. Yet both were making classic after classic after classic. So to wrap up this idea that I'm discussing, it's safe to say that when it comes to Frankenstein, Cushing and Fisher were a true dynamic duo. Now, this does nothing to underplay the importance of the writers themselves, notably Jimmy Sangster, Anthony Hines, who would go by the pseudonym John Elder. Those two people in particular. Together, they'd help pen 5 of the Frankenstein movies. And both men proved to be the creative powerhouse behind many of Hammer's classic Gothic horror movies in general, for all 3 of the major franchises that I've mentioned earlier, and more. You see, now, this was truly a collaborative process, another means of comparing the Hammer films to the kaiju tokusatsu movies over at Toho. But Hammer was not as much of a factory like Toho was at this time. But the word to describe them by many film historians is a family, being run and kempt, two families for multiple generations, starting all the way back in the 1930s and ending in the late 1970s. And anyone familiar with the repertoire of character actors and crewmen of Hammer horror will understand what I mean when I say watching a Hammer film is like watching, a family reunion of the best possible caliber, because you keep seeing the same faces over and over and over again. There's a warmth to these movies, especially if you're a film historian like me. And to harken back to the beginning of all of this, the Frankenstein series marks both an opening chapter for Hammer and a closing chapter. I find it fitting that Hammer was redefined by the success of Curse of Frankenstein, to which started almost 30-year, 20-year chapter for them, where they'd focus specifically on Gothic horror. But the series would also end with Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, which served not just as a conclusion for the series in which we're discussing today, but also the end of Hammer itself. The Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. Very fitting for the subject matter of Hammer's Frankenstein series. But I'd even take that a step further. I'd argue that the end of Hammer's Frankenstein marked the end of Gothic horror being a predominant form of horror, making way for younger filmmakers, slashers, new genres, just movies in nature. It all feels kind of poetic. I see somebody in the comment mention George Lucas being a fan of Hammer. There we go. He was a part of that new generation. He was making new types of genre pictures, but he was a fan of these films. The new generation of filmmakers. All that I've discussed thus far serves as an overture for the film series to follow. So let's start in the beginning. Curse of Frankenstein. We're going to take a small break here while I get a cup of water, since I left it elsewhere, but we will be right back.
You are interrupting my work.
Your work. The work of the devil.
Hans, please, Father. You can't. No!
We interrupt your normal broadcast to bring you this brief message. ANP is proud to have become a History Fix affiliate. History Fix is a streaming service for history nerds like you and me. This includes some of our own productions, such as the uncut and uncensored version of our documentary on the Battle at Remagen, along with our short documentary breaking down the Boston Massacre moment by moment. So head on over using either the link on your screen right now or by scanning the QR code and save 30% off the annual subscription price by using the promo code 30% off. Thank you, and let's keep history alive.
Peter Cushing as the Baron, and Peter Woodthorpe as the ruthless Professor Zoltan, who fought the Baron for control of the monster.
Oh, he'll understand you, all right. He just won't obey you. That's all.
Duncan Lamont as the Chief of Police. Katie Wilde and Sanderels as two young people caught up in the evil of Frankenstein.
Get out of his way, you fool!
Go back and kill him.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Now we are talking Curse of Frankenstein. Now, Curse of Frankenstein came about from desperation. You know, it wasn't because of a driving want to make these movies. Hammer had been around for years prior to this movie's production, but by the 1950s, it was in dire straits. They just weren't making money. They were losing money left and right, not making it, and they made middling B pictures of all sorts of dramas, some even starring Bela Lugosi, by the way. But in their desperation, they made 3 movies that were all smash hits. British censors had recently made the X certificate, movies too adult and scary for general audiences. Kind of silly now when you kind of think about it, but because of that, you know, a lot of theaters wouldn't play X-rated films, and you know, a lot of studios sort of avoided making those X-rated films. But Hammer made the decision to embrace it by remaking 2 television serials with that X rating certificate. That was the Quatermass Experiment and Quatermass 2. Note, Experiment was removed, or the E in Experiment was removed, so you see the big X right there on screen. You notice that. Then they'd make another great film that kind of reminds me of The Blob in some ways. It reminds me of The Blob in some ways. And that film was The X Unknown, which was also a smash hit. So you had 3 smash hits right off the bat. And all 3 of these movies are fantastic. They are great watches. I can't recommend them enough. Go check them out. And I think at least 2 of them were. At least 2 of them, I think, were directed by Val Guest, who's another director I applaud. He directed The Abominable Snowman of the Himalayas, which is a movie with Peter Cushing that I highly recommend. As for questions, I have a Q&A section at the end of this that I will definitely answer and love to discuss with the audience a little bit further. But for right now, we are in the middle of a kind of lecture of sorts. Hopefully you guys are enjoying listening to me ramble on. So what's next? They make these 3 movies. What is Hammer to do? So they decided to risk it all on Frankenstein. Frankenstein. But not in black and white like they had with those other 3 films. This time they were going to do it in glorious color. And all the blood and gore the 1957 could conjure. In fact, this would be the first Frankenstein movie to be filmed in color. And audiences loved it. British and American audiences lined up in droves for this film. This disgusting and shocking movie that, despite what the critics had said, they themselves loved it. Because while critics despised Curse of Frankenstein, the people certainly did not. People were fainting, screaming, they were laughing. This movie had it all. And it truly paved a way for the gory films that we would get in the 1970s and the 1980s, along with the masterclass of films, of films Hammer would produce within the near future. They wouldn't have happened without Curse of Frankenstein. And it wasn't just critics who hated it. Actor Robert Urquhart, who played opposite Peter Cushing within this movie, was so disgusted he actually stormed out of the movie. And he quit Hammer. He would never work for them again. He had been a regular before that. Only if he knew of the madness that was about to come because of the success of this movie and the fame it might have brought him. Frankenstein is awesome. Peter Cushing wanted this role. He wanted it bad. And he campaigned for it with the charm and, a little bit of annoyance toward Hammer producers. But he was thankfully given the role because it was Cushing who truly makes this film worth watching to this day. James Rolfe said something interesting in his Monster Madness series covering the Frankenstein movies. He said, quote, "What makes a mad scientist great is how much they believe in what they are doing, but also we sympathize with them." Now, Cushing certainly does the first, but not the second. See, Frankenstein is an asshole. He's a man who cares for nothing but his own work, and if he helps someone, it is to serve his own ends. Though helping someone is a rarity. It is rarity. He kills his lover brutally for by giving her to the creature. He kills the professor to get the brain in a scene which has one of the best stunts I have ever seen in it. And if you've seen the movie, you know which stunt I'm talking about. How that stuntman didn't break his neck, I just don't know. And it all feels so organic. It's so crazy. Peter Cushing starts off as an arrogant but youthful, then morphing into an obsession of creating life, even if it means ending others. And Cushing steals every frame he is in. So is Curse a masterpiece? I can't say that it is. I find it quite slow at parts, and sometimes I feel Cushing doesn't quite have his character yet as compared to the other films. Yet that also works, considering the fact that this is the origin story for Victor Frankenstein. And that it is also the origins of Hammer's gothic horror as well, and this film echoes that in its execution. It feels prototypish, right? We see the beginnings of greatness, but it isn't quite there yet. Not quite. The greatness that would be, in my opinion, realized the following year when the same creative team would make Horror of Dracula. But that film wouldn't be possible without the success brought forth by Curse of Frankenstein. The unfortunate part of this film is one I'll see repeated in the other movies within the series, the monster. To me, this is the biggest hindrance of Curse of Frankenstein. Christopher Lee plays the decaying, disgusting monstrosity creature Frankenstein creates within this movie. And he does great, with what he's given, right? And it's not much. He's not given much to do. And that is where Curse falters for me, completely. While the makeup on him is absolutely fantastic, and Lee is great too, I can't not emphasize that enough. There isn't much for him to do but bumble about, which is a great contrast to Boris Karloff's depiction of the creature. Now, this is an also kind of ironic counter to Universal. Jack Pierce labored extensively when creating the look and makeup for Boris Karloff's creature. It took hours every day to put it on, to the point Karloff would just go home after the shoot was done, to keep the makeup on to save time for the next day. Just imagine how uncomfortable that was. Now, Jack Leakey, who did the makeup for Curse, specifically the creature, and it was done completely at the last possible second. You think it'd be an important part, knowing what your monster looks like, but in this case, I guess not, because they literally had no idea what they wanted Christopher Lee to look like. But believe it or not, that sort of rushed nature of the makeup for Christopher Lee's creature, it actually kind of works because it feels improvised. And I feel like that improvisation kind of complements the improvised nature of the monster itself. So, in my humble opinion, they got a little lucky. Now, this feels like a stepping stone for Lee playing monsters, Christopher Lee playing monsters, because he'd not just shine but define the role of Dracula, but he could speak with that role, right? He couldn't speak as the creature in Curse of Frankenstein, but he could speak if he played Dracula. And his makeup, while present, is very minimal compared to the creature in Curse. So a more apt comparison in terms of roles Christopher Lee has played that was also a creature would be The Mummy, where Lee, with only his eyes, gives a magnificent performance under pounds and pounds of makeup. Perhaps they learned by 1959 of the power of Lee's acting capabilities by then, while in Curse, they were just sort of playing around of sorts, so that might explain it. But if Hammer couldn't mimic Boris Karloff's creature, they certainly succeeded in doing the opposite of Universal's creature. I mean, look at the poster here. It looks nothing like Boris Karloff's thing. The creature of Curse is unsympathetic, it's creepy, and it is grotesque. And while less sophisticated, it certainly plays into Hammer's obsession with earning the X certificate. Now, as an interesting side note, I wanted to note this. 1975's Rocky Horror Picture Show has Frankenfurter play Frankenstein, right? He is the stand-in for that Dr. Frankenfurter, Frankenstein. When he makes Rocky in Rocky Horror Picture Show, it isn't the Universal monster it is spoofing, the creation of the Universal monster. It's Hammer's. Just a note I would like to sort of point out, just something that I noticed, and I couldn't help but notice it, and it shows how influential this movie was in the realm of horror. That includes the bandages of Christopher Lee is wrapped up in, so is Rocky, to the chamber he is held inside, and it being filled with a liquid. It is cloudy in Curse, while it is gay, rainbow-colored in Rocky Horror. I love it. Just wanted to make note of that. But the success of Frankenstein would mean only one thing. We need another. And another we shall get with Revenge of Frankenstein. Now, Revenge of Frankenstein reunites Peter Cushing with director Terence Fisher, with this being made the same year as Horror of Dracula. It was a busy year for Hammer's Sorry, my Maynard came out. A busy year for Hammer's cast and crew. They were going, they were going to carpe the hell out of this diem of Curse of Frankenstein and the success of it, because Hammer knew they had a moneymaker and that this would be their sort of treasure chest, gothic horror. And they would ride the hell out of this wave all the way to the bank, transforming Hammer from a fledgling B-movie studio to one of the most successful in Britain. So in 1958, Hammer greenlit 2 movies. These movies would be firing on all thrusters, directed by Terence Fisher, written by Jimmy Sangster, produced by Anthony Hines, and cinematography by Jack Asher. The who's who of Hammer, the best of the best. And these movies were Horror of Dracula, which would launch Christopher Lee into stardom, and the one that we're about to discuss, Revenge of Frankenstein. Now, to me, this is probably the most overlooked of the Peter Cushing Frankenstein movies, to the point it was the second to last in the series that I actually watched. It took me forever to watch this movie, believe it or not. I even forgot that this movie existed for a very long time, but it is an excellent sequel, taking place directly where the last one ended. And I certainly do not regret watching it. I greatly enjoy this movie. Now, what separates this film from the previous is the fact that there actually isn't a monster in this movie. A Frankenstein movie with no monster? My God. But it works, ladies and gentlemen. It works wonderfully. because the elements of the previous film started to get ignored. Forgive me. Just reading my notes. Getting my notes a little noted. It works. And the reason why it works is because the elements of the previous film started to get ironed out and perfected here. This is a character film from beginning to end, not just for Frankenstein, but his subject too. Where instead of building a monster, Frankenstein transplants the brain of a physically disabled man into the body of a healthy one. But of course, things go awry rather quickly. I like the fact that Frankenstein has to hide, because of the end of the previous film. So he goes by the name of Stein, subtle, He also shows that he's progressed while working at a hospital for the lower classes. He has a chimpanzee that was a successful experiment to an extent other than that it is now carnivorous for some reason, and almost rabid, but who's paying attention? Everyone forgets about that. An interesting note about the chimpanzee, actually, and this made me laugh. Apparently, the ape took a liking to Peter Cushing, because who wouldn't? He's Peter fucking Cushing. And every day the ape was on set, it wouldn't cooperate until Cushing gave it a kiss. I found this in his memoirs, and I think it is really, really funny. So there isn't as much gore in Revenge of Frankenstein, yet it feels grosser nonetheless. And I'm not sure if that is from the setting of it being, or if it's from the setting, it being in an insane asylum and a lower class hospital, or if it was a director decision made by Terrence Fisher and cinematographer Jack Asher. I don't know which is which. Probably a mixture of both. But we have Frankenstein hurting people in a hospital for the lower classes because one goes missing and no one will care. It's pretty pessimistic outlook that this movie seems to have. Welcome to the Victorian era. Freudian slip there. Welcome to the Victorian era. Yet Frankenstein is also helping his crippled assistant, right? Right? And the thing I find fascinating is that the experiment would have worked had the cripple not been hit in the head with a goddamn chair. And unlike the previous movie, one scene gives me actual chills. The insistent in his new body crashes the party, and he begins begging Frankenstein for help. He sounds so pitiful, and yet Frankenstein, who is hiding, tries to play it cool. It's a great scene in a film full of great scenes. The film is also full of tension, some genuine tension, most notably between the inmates and Frankenstein himself. They know he's up to no good and fear him, so the ultimate uprising at the end is well foreshadowed. And when they do attack Frankenstein, they don't hold back. They even kill him in the process. They actually kill Victor Frankenstein. But Frankenstein's brain is then transplanted into another body that happens to look just like Peter Cushing, and thus invites a sequel of its own. Now, despite that I don't have too much to say about this film, I do like this movie more than Curse of Frankenstein for the sole reason of me liking the quote-unquote monster. Carl is very sympathetic, and the writing makes me care about his plight and the wish to be left alone. He says, quote, "All my life I've been stared at. All I want is to disappear." It's a great line. It's absolutely fantastic, and something I found lacking within the previous movie. It's a great contrast to the callousness of Frankenstein himself, who was always belittling everyone as a lesser, in a beautifully arrogant, almost scene-chewing style only Peter Cushing could possibly, pull off. You hate Frankenstein here. You hate him. But you also want more. He is a true prototype for some of the anti-heroes we'd get throughout the 1970s, even to today. He's the undisputed villain of these films, yet he's also the protagonist and also the main character. This being a trend copied from Universal in movies such as House of Frankenstein. It was popular in the 1940s, and it kind of died in the positive 50s, which had a more uplifting kind of vibe to them, to the movies from the 50s. But then it returned and drove in the 1960s, which is when counterculture became a thing, right? And it was Hammer who truly perfected this dynamic of a main character within their film. Something you can feel as far as today in movies such as The Joker. You feel it in there. Or a show like House of Cards, Breaking Bad, Ozark, and more. I feel bad for this movie in a few ways. Despite me liking it more than Curse of Frankenstein, it sits in the shadow of the following films. Yet it also sits... So it sits in the shadow of the films that follow. And it also sits just in front of Curse of Frankenstein itself. Curse being the first and therefore studied and cherished more. And Revenge really does deserve more praise and critical analysis than what it has. But that aside, Revenge would be all we get for Frankenstein for about 6 years. Which is odd, because it made a lot of money for Hammer. So why did Hammer push Frankenstein aside for so long? Well, we'll get into those reasons when we come back. And when we start discussing the evil of Frankenstein, which is what we are going to do right now. Right now, we are talking about the remaining 3 films of Peter Cushing's Frankenstein movies. And we will be starting this section off with 1964, Evil of Frankenstein. So, ladies and gentlemen, we will be right back.
I am a doctor, you know.
I have decided to extend my leniency to its limits by only sentencing you to be committed to the state asylum for the criminally insane for a period of 5 years.
Behind these walls, cut off from a world of reality outside, confined to a world of madness and brutality within, Frankenstein lives.
I knew you couldn't give up your work completely. And you haven't.
Frankenstein returns as dedicated as ever to one unholy purpose, to build a living being.
I succeeded this time. In every sacrifice will be worthwhile.
But what monstrous creature will emerge here when it can only be created from the bodies of the criminally insane?
There's a monster at last!
Only Frankenstein, only his incredible mind could create such uncontrollable terror.
Yes!
To Baron Frankenstein, creator of man.
Creator of blasphemy from the bodies of psychopaths. A living thing.
Welcome back, everybody, to Hammer's Frankenstein, a complete retrospective of the Peter... I cannot speak. A complete retrospective of the Peter Cushing Frankenstein movies. And right now, we will be talking about the remaining 3 films of the Peter Cushing Frankenstein movies. And we will be starting this section off with 1964's Evil of Frankenstein. Now, I concluded the last part asking why Hammer would push one of their most successful properties aside for what was essentially 6 years. The answer actually comes from the studio, which initially gave them the hardest time, Universal. That's because after the smash success of Curse of Frankenstein, then Horror of Dracula, then again with Revenge of Frankenstein, it seemed Universal finally saw the writing on the wall. Universal horror had been in decline since the mid-1940s, and many consider their last hurrah in the genre of monsters, being The Creature from the Black Lagoon and the two films that followed, which each one of those films, the returns diminished significantly every time, the series ending with the fledgling creature walks among us. They just couldn't contest the money and economic means Hammer possessed come the late 1950s. Black and white was out, color and gore was in. So in a surprise move, a move that genuinely surprised everybody at Hammer, the new heads of Universal agreed to open their repertoire of properties to Hammer themselves. And what exactly did this mean? This means suddenly that small British studio had access to loads of new Gothic material. The Mummy, Phantom of the Opera, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Wolfman, and that is exactly what a majority of the productions were that Hammer were working on between 1958 and 1964. Michael Carreras, what many consider the other half of Hammer, went on to work on the Mummy series, and he does a phenomenal job. He even directed one. While Anthony Hines would produce movies like Curse of the Werewolf, starring Oliver Reed, which was supposed to be a movie about the Spanish Inquisition, but when suddenly they had access to all these Universal properties, well, the pivot seemed only natural, considering all the sets that they had built. Hammer spent extravagantly on what was supposed to be a Cary Grant vehicle, believe it or not, in their remake of The Phantom of the Opera. Both did okay. They did okay at the box office, but they were nowhere near as successful as Frankenstein or Dracula. That was very clear. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde got an interesting Hammer treatment with the two faces of Dr. Jekyll, all in which were directed by Terence Fisher. He directed Curse, Phantom, Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll. He was on a roll here. And all three of these movies, by the way, I think are actually great films. My least favorite being The Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll, but I do like the premise of that film, where instead of the doctor transforming into a monster, he transforms into a handsome young man who acts like a morally corrupt monster and womanizer. That is the premise of that film. I also adore The Mummy, and even its follow-up, again directed by Michael Carreras itself, Curse of the Mummy's Tomb. Curse of the Mummy's Tomb is subjectively my favorite mummy movie ever. I absolutely love that film. Curse of the Werewolf is widely considered one of the best werewolf movies ever made, and it is, in fact, my personal favorite. Certainly, it is the most tragic of them, by a leaping mile, actually, if you watch the movie. Even Phantom of the Opera, while a very flawed movie, is quite the spectacle, and it would have been very interesting to see what direction Hammer would have taken should it have been more successful. Herbert Lom, by the way, plays an outstanding Phantom, and he alone makes the movie worthwhile makes it a worthwhile watch. Meanwhile, Dracula got a sequel in 1960, despite Christopher Lee not wanting to return to the role. Brides of Dracula is a beautiful movie, and mixing this with Terence Fisher's The Devil Rides Out, I think the two make for Hammer's most spectacular work, though neither are my favorite. The most unfortunate thing to happen with Brides of Dracula is that it would be cinematographer Jack Asher's last film with Hammer, as he sort of, he was kind of the man who created that initial original look that we got with Hammer's Gothic horror films. He had been the DP for Curse, Dracula, Revenge of Frankenstein, The Mummy, Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll. I mean, all of those are classics. All of those are cult classics, really, I should say. But he proved to be too slow and too costly for Hammer to continue hiring, so he was let go. But during this period, Frankenstein hadn't been forgotten. He'd been kind of brooding there in the background. Anthony Hines had been working hard behind the scenes to possibly develop a Frankenstein television series with Columbia Pictures, and it was Michael Carreras who would take it to America. The show would have been called Tales of Frankenstein and seemed to really run with the idea of Victor Frankenstein getting into all sorts of shenanigans every week, creating monster and failed experiments left and right. They shot a pilot, in 1958, one that is apparently available on the new 4K UHD limited edition release of Curse of Frankenstein. Anton Drifting playing Baron Frankenstein. However, there was a lot of friction between Hammer and distributor Columbia Pictures. And what was planned to be a 26-episode series, each episode being about 24 minutes long, never manifested. Michael Carreras really headed this, as a representative for Hammer, but Columbia took too much control, throwing away the scripts by Anthony Hines and opting to use scripts written in-house. This left Carreras rather dejected, and so he would return to Britain and completely abandon the idea, having failed to make a bigger stamp in Hollywood. Now, interestingly, Columbia had the right of all of Universal's monsters, so the monsters in the pilot of Tales of Frankenstein look shockingly like Boris Karloff's iteration, something at the time Hammer couldn't do. But that would all change soon, as I had discussed a bit earlier. So finally, in 1964, Hammer put forward a new Frankenstein movie, Evil of Frankenstein. With Universal's support, the movie certainly looked bigger than the other two films in the series. The monster would even have a flat head, looking like a decaying version of the Boris Karloff creature. As if the monster from Curse of Frankenstein... It's almost as if the monster from Curse of Frankenstein had sex with the Boris Karloff creature, and this is what we got as a result. Bam, we got that thing. that thing. And the sets are also fantastic, with lots of blue lights, electronic devices, buzzing, and great sound effects. The movie looks big. It looks much bigger than the previous two films. It feels big, and it's because it was big. It looks fantastic and is a great departure from the previous two Frankenstein films. And part of this was because of the higher budget. But the other key element was the director itself. This would be the only one of the Peter Cushing Frankenstein films not to be directed by Terence Fisher. He was asked to helm this project, but he couldn't due to an apparent car crash he was a part of. I've seen some varying sources on the timeline of when that accident happened, but I heard it started here. And Terence Fisher's being unable to helm the project, this left producer Anthony Hines to give the movie over to a cinematographer who had been working at Hammer. His name was Freddie Francis. Francis he has quite a filmography as a cinematographer. Two notable works I'd like to mention would be The Elephant Man and Dune, both directed by David Lynch. He'd also DP Glory, one of the best Civil War movies ever made. He also directed films like The Skull, Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, and the cult classic Trog, starring Joan Crawford. I believe his work here is very good, just as he does with Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. The camera moves a lot. There, aren't as many static shots like we'd see with Terence Fisher. It's certainly a different, more modern take or style than what we would see with Terence Fisher, and you can tell the man had his eye on cinematography. You can tell that's what he was an expert at, shooting some rather eerie scenes, and also directing Peter Cushing very, very, very well. The opening scene, in particular, is a very effective hitter. Very well shot and paced to the point that I'd argue it's actually superior to anything Terence Fisher did, any of his teasers seen within these movies. In fact, it's one of the best openings for a Hammer horror flick, period. It's well shot, it's well lit, full of creative camera movements, and Frankenstein's reveal is just plain awesome. It's just awesome. And everything I want in a Hammer Frankenstein film, summed up within 3 minutes is in the opening of this movie. It's got Peter Cushing, it's got grave robbers, it's got dead corpses, it's got murder, it's got fire, it's got everything I want in it, right? The issues many have with Evil of Frankenstein stem from a few common things I've noticed. The first is the script. The movie feels more like an homage to the old Universal Frankenstein movies than a Hammer Frankenstein movie. The monster is found in ice, the castle blowing up at the end, the equipment used to revive that creature, a man using the monster to murder people who had wronged him. You see elements of Son of Frankenstein, Ghost of Frankenstein, Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, and even House of Frankenstein, you notice within this movie, which, to me, makes the movie a lot of fun. That's stuff that I love about it. As if watching those movies, but, it's like I was watching those movies, but instead I saw Peter Cushing, there was gore, and it was in glorious color. The monster design, too. Do I need to mention that again? Feels like an homage to Universal. So I don't really agree with that. But the other issue I do. This one I actually agree with. And this movie is blatantly not in continuity with the previous two films. The flashbacks showing Frankenstein's first experiments aren't from Curse, but original material featuring the monster in this movie. To make note of that, his assistant Hans is not the same Hans from the previous film. Even Frankenstein acts kind of oddly here. While still possessing that cold callousness we'd seen before, he appears more naive and evil. He knows the villagers hate him, yet he almost causes a scene because he witnesses people misusing his property. The Frankenstein from the previous films, he wouldn't be happy for sure, but I don't think he would want to make a scene like we do within this film. He'd likely find a way to kill them instead, and probably use them for his experiments instead. Something that plagued the Mummy movies, to pivot just for a little bit, something that plagued the Mummy movies after the first film is that the titular mummies stopped being played by trained thespians. We have the one by Christopher Lee, and all the one afters are basically played by big stuntmen. This is exactly my biggest problem with Evil, is that its monster is not played by a thespian. It's played by a New Zealand wrestler named Kiwi Kingston. And if you didn't know, he was from New Zealand beforehand, but that name certainly gives it away. I don't want to knock the man too much because I'm sure he did the best he could with what was given, but Kiwi is no Christopher Lee or Boris Karloff, or Glenn Strange for that matter. But he does have the physicality of a big, lumbering monster. If only he did merely the stunts, and someone else played the creature for the more dramatic scenes. I say this because there's some good dramaticism with the monster in Evil, particularly with the relationship to the mute girl that we see throughout it. The fact that she is mute and he a lumbering monster has a lot of potential for a Beauty and the Beast kind of story, and I think writer Anthony Hines was attempting to do this in a similar vein to the Mummy films. If only Jimmy Sangster had written this, actually, it might have come out a little bit better. As is, it just sort of falls flat. And largely, I think it's because of Kiwi Kingston, and him not being an actor, and a little bit of Anthony Hines' script. Interestingly, we'd see this sort of plot element used for the last Hammer Frankenstein film, Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. There is one scene where Kiwi does manage to shine, and that is the ending. Listening to the monster panic as the castle burns all around him is handled very, very, very well. I think it is his screaming which shockingly makes this monster seem more human. I think that's what elevated it. Something lacking, for the most part, in the deaths scene in the Universal movies, where they just happen. This, you actually hear it, and you kind of see it, and it is kind of, it's horror. It fits that mantra. But as a result, many fans consider Evil to be the worst of the Peter Cushing Frankenstein films. But I disagree. In terms of continuity, yeah, it certainly doesn't fit. But if you take this movie for a movie in of itself, I actually think it works overall very well. Mainly due to the great performance by Peter Cushing and Katie Wilde, who plays the mute girl. I quite enjoy this movie, and I tend to put it as one, I tend to put this a little bit higher than most in this series. I enjoyed this movie a lot. I tend to put it on in the background a lot, too. I tend to put this specific movie on in the background quite a bit. I like the look of the movie, I like the tone, and I like the feel. And as a fan of Universal horror movies, I love all the homages done with a Hammer twist. And I stand firm that if anyone was to replace Terence Fisher for a Frankenstein director, I am glad Anthony Hines chose Freddie Francis. Evidently, Cushing thought so too. The pair got along very well, apparently, on set, and this would be the first of 8 films they made together. To just compare, Terence Fisher would direct Peter Cushing 10 times. So now we move on to the next Peter Cushing Frankenstein movie, Frankenstein Created Woman. Now, this is widely considered to be the best of Hammer's Frankenstein, and for good reason. Again, there is no monster, per se, within this movie, instead it being an amalgamation of 2 people, the body of a woman and the soul of her lover, which is an insane concept, but let's roll with it. It's well known that Martin Scorsese even considers this to be one of his favorite films, which I believe helps elevate this movie above the others in terms of cine respect, quote-unquote. And he loves the movie simply for its concept. Frankenstein tries to secure the soul. This whole movie is insane, ladies and gentlemen. This movie is fucking nuts. I can buy all the brain swapping stuff we've seen thus far, but to actually trap the soul... I do love the sci-fi nature of this movie, though. This movie is the most sci-fi out of them all. It's Frankenstein moving ahead to creating life and truly looking to conquer death. And once again, his biggest success is done on himself. He being frozen for an hour, then revived and turning out just fine, which is kind of hard to believe since this movie only takes place over about a week, but whatever. Frankenstein does a lot for a man who have just died, right? Frankenstein literally dies at the beginning of this movie, and he does so much throughout this movie, even though it takes place over the course of a week. I think he would be a lot weaker than what he actually is. You have to kind of buy that. But he is as callous as ever. Anthony Hines returned to pen this film, and Terence Fisher returns to direct. Certainly a return to form from the previous film, but also with the music. James Bernard has returned to do the score. He did the score for the first Frankenstein film, and that was it. He had returned to the series until now. But he's certainly most noted for his scores in the Dracula movies, creating that very, very, very iconic theme. And some trivia about him: James Bernard wasn't a composer initially, but a writer. And it was his writing that got him to work with his lifelong partner, Paul Dane. For those of you who don't know who Paul Dane is largely responsible for several James Bond movies he had worked on. But for me, I know him because he worked on 4 out of the 5 original Planet of the Apes movies, all in which I adore. So James Bernard did exceptionally well at Hammer, making larger-than-life gothic scores with a very small orchestra, often using clashing brass and stringed instruments to create a harsh sound. Again, you hear this a lot in his Dracula scores, but also here as well, though I find his score in Frankenstein Created Woman to be kind of subdued compared to a lot of his other scores, especially comparing to his previous score, The Devil Rides Out, which is very dark and it's a very brooding score. Then again, this is a more string-orientated score. Frankenstein Created Woman uses a lot more strings than we saw in The Devil Rides Out, and that tends to be, to the more metaphysical and the thematic elements that permeates the whole movie. The strings fit, if you were to study it. It's also just a great theme. It's a great theme. Out of all the Frankenstein scores, I think this is the most memorable. So you have the 3 of those people mixed together, and you get a movie that feels a little bit more familiar. Yet the concept is what keeps this movie from being, a simple retread. The film also establishes a possible continuity with the previous film in the Frankenstein series, because we notice that he can't really use his hands. But because they were burned, they lack the precision needed for his experiments, which also gives him an excuse as to why Frankenstein keeps trying to find a new assistant. and why he does have one within every movie. But what I think sets this movie objectively above the others is Anthony Hines' script. It's a wonderful mishmash of humor and horror. This was present all the way back from the first film, but not so much as it is here. And unlike the previous entries, much of this stems from the great chemistry, or I should say lack thereof, between Frankenstein and his assistant, Dr. Hertz. This blending of horror and comedy would be retreaded upon in the near future, when Hammer tried to reinvigorate their Frankenstein series by making a prequel of sorts in The Horror of Frankenstein, a movie we won't be covering tonight, but one that does deserve some mention within the history of Hammer. But it's the morality play of this film script that truly draws me in, and what I think makes this truly a classic. This element really makes Frankenstein Created Woman a gem. Frankenstein is oddly the most human in this movie, fitting considering we are discussing the human soul in what it is. The other films show people willingly going along with Frankenstein's experiments, or those willingly working for him. The tragedy of this is two characters just happening to be caught in the middle of these experiments, Hans and Christine. Note that these two people, I like these two people very much, and note that I'm actually discussing them now instead of doing a generic retrospective. I'm actually mentioning them by name. I like them so much. These two are innocence corrupted, is what was described by some critics. They find solace in each other, and yet, in Hammer fashion, they are violently ripped apart. Hans, elements we've seen in other Hammer horror. These are elements that we've seen in other Hammer horror, but not so much in Frankenstein until now. Had Frankenstein not shown up, the two would have likely been just fine. This is a contrast to the crippled assistant in Revenge, or the reviving of a lumbering beast in The Evil of Frankenstein. If anything, this harkens back to Curse, where Frankenstein accidentally shoots his wife in the process of trying to destroy his own creation. And at the end, this theme of innocence almost looks to have brought back some humanity to Frankenstein himself, though the next film blatantly shows the opposite to be true. Now, I mentioned earlier the elements that seem to be retreaded from previous movies. We have the devoted but confused assistant. We have the victims. We have the creature going on a killing spree. The last time this happened, the monster was controlled by someone seeking revenge. The same happens here, though the twist is that the man is seeking revenge only nominally exists. That man only nominally exists. So while familiar, it isn't a carbon copy. It's just original enough. We also have the angry villagers, the experiment going wrong, bubbling and idiotic police, a deformed and crippled person, and the woman in this case, the guillotine itself, a bunch of different things. So I applaud Anthony Hines for making this not feel like a boring sequel when it easily could have been. If anything, it showed this franchise still had strange and mysterious places to explore, and that Baron Frankenstein isn't finished with us just yet. Now, I mentioned Frankenstein burned his hands a little bit earlier. It's a bit of continuity, and this I find interesting because Evil is blatantly a reboot of sorts. It breaks continuity with the previous two entries, blatantly. Now, I've seen some people say Evil is an outlier, and that Frankenstein Created Woman is more of a sequel to Revenge than to Evil, which does make sense. I can see it, and that does work. And I think Victor's character fits more in line with the Victor from Curse and Revenge than it does with Evil. It genuinely looks more like those two films as well, and it flows a bit more like those two films. And again, thanks a lot in part to Terence Fisher. But I offer another hypothesis here. I almost consider Curse and Revenge a duology, right? Well, this film is set as the second part of a quadrilogy starting with Evil of Frankenstein. I point to two elements. First, Frankenstein has no tattoo on his arm as established with the body swap of the end of Revenge, and there are burnt hands. Evil ended in his castle exploding, and there being lots of fire in the process. Revenge ends with Frankenstein being beaten to a pulp by the inmates, so no burns. There's also the fact that Frankenstein isn't really hiding in Frankenstein Created Woman. He's not hiding. When called to court as a witness for Hans, he is called blatantly Baron Frankenstein, not Victor, interestingly. They stopped calling him Victor in these movies. Now, this seems to be a large continuity mistake from either hypothesis you subscribe to, Frankenstein being on the run. Frankenstein is supposed to be on the run, so why is he not Dr. Stein and then Dr. Frank in Revenge? What happened to that? So who knows? Again, continuity back in the 60s, what was that? Nobody really cared. And I don't think we should be spending, this much time on continuity when it's blatantly clear that different writers of these movies just didn't care whatsoever. But at least it flows a bit easier than Universal's incarnations. But yeah, just to mention that, I had to. Now, I wish to circle back to Terence Fisher in this moment, as Frankenstein Created Woman would be one of his last pictures. It's crazy to look back at his career both before Curse of Frankenstein and after. He'd been a staple for Hammer long before 1957, directing loads of different movies from war films to comedies. B pictures mainly, of course. Noir seemed to be quite popular in his filmography as well. But in many ways, I'd categorize him as sort of like what's the term? A journeyman director, I guess. He was basically fulfilling the role for whatever picture the studio deemed fit. Didn't matter if he specialized in something or not. He'd direct the movie well, competently, and finish the picture on time and schedule. Most importantly, because it's Hammer, on budget. So, Curse truly changed this man's career. After Curse, he would make Hound of the Baskervilles and Kill Me Tomorrow. The rest were horror. Even after Hammer distanced themselves from him after the box office failures of Curse and Curse of the Werewolf and Phantom of the Opera, he'd make horror for other companies. One film to come to mind is Island of Terror in 1966, also starring Peter Cushing, or Tomorrow Dies Screaming, a personal favorite of a few friends of mine. Yet by 1966, his career had begun to die down, though likely not due to him aging. It's more likely he stopped directing so much after he got into a horrible car crash, which resulted in him suffering from severe pain and long bouts where he'd just be essentially crippled. Certainly unable to direct, if that is the case. And this is why he couldn't direct Evil of Frankenstein, and apparently the pain he had from his injuries only worsened with age. Yet for his final 3 Frankenstein movies, it is a testament to his brilliant, relaxed directorial style that it doesn't show. They all carry this grand emphasis on performance, adding class to what others might deem as lowbrow exploitation. In many ways, I find the career of Terence Fisher to echo that of Toho director Ishiro Honda, to bring this up again. Both worked expertly on genre pictures, making them of roughly the same caliber to the, roughly same success. Both made all sorts of different films prior to a fluke. Terence, it was Curse of Frankenstein. Ishiro Honda, it was Godzilla, the original. From that point forward, they both were slotted into mainly directing genre pictures. Horror for Fisher, science fiction for Honda. But unlike Honda, who grew very weary of this new career direction, Terence Fisher fucking loved it. Despite him being a very religious man, he absolutely loved making these horror movies, both big and small. And it shows. Even his weaker films, like The Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll, have a charm and class to them that elevate them higher than what we'd see being made by other studios, by different directors at the same exact time. And I personally think Frankenstein Created Woman is one of the best examples of this. Exploitative in its title and premise, certainly not overly grand. It could have easily been a simple run-of-the-mill B-movie picture. but it isn't. And it's a lot of this comes down to the pure enthusiasm and professionalism of its director. That isn't to downplay the script or Peter Cushing's script doctoring, I should say, but more of a means of celebrating the general, putting it all together into a comprehensive whole. So that's that's Frankenstein Created Woman. Now we're going to move into the final two. We're going to take another small break while I kind of calm my voice down a little bit, but we'll move on to Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. We'll be right back.
Be careful! You damage it!
Only 2 women ever entered this house of evil.
We interrupt your normal broadcast to bring you this brief message. ANP is proud to have become a History Fix affiliate. History Fix is a streaming service for history nerds like you and me. This includes some of our own productions, such as the uncut and uncensored version of our documentary on the Battle at Remagen, along with our short documentary breaking down the Boston Massacre moment by moment. So head on over using either the link on your screen right now or by scanning the QR code and save 30% off the annual subscription price by using the promo code 30% off. Thank you, and let's keep history alive.
For your sake and to protect Elizabeth, I've so far kept silent. But now I shall go to the authorities and have them destroy that creature. And see that you pay for these atrocities. No!
In the year 1860, I, Baron Frankenstein, was sentenced to death on the guillotine. Why? Why had the world condemned me? Because I was the first man to create another living being. The first unnatural man. But because his brain was affected, because he could not control his animal instincts, he was hunted down and brutally murdered. But I have escaped the guillotine, and I shall avenge the death of my creation.
Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. That's a hell of a title. And yes, I mean it. Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. This is my personal favorite of the Hammer Frankenstein pictures, by far. Once again, Peter Cushing reprises his role, Terence Fisher directs, and James Bernard returns to do the score. But this time, the script was written by Anthony Nelson Keyes and Burt Batt, both replacing Anthony Hines, who'd penned the last 2 Frankenstein movies. Now, why is that? Well, after Frankenstein Created Woman, Anthony Hines quit Hammer, not being happy there for a long time. He'd been a staple here for most of the heyday of Hammer's foray into gothic horror and even before it. Though he'd return as a script writer several more times periodically going forward, he'd never be a producer again. It is as if Hammer could give up Anthony Hines, but Hines couldn't give up Hammer. That's what it kind of feels like. And I mention this because it serves as a foreshadow for what was coming for Hammer. As by the end, by the mid to late 1960s, I should say, the genre and success Hammer held in the British film industry had rapidly begun to wane. Hines found himself working harder and harder, only to find himself being sued for plagiarism for his work on Taste the Blood of Dracula. And this proved to be the final straw for him. He quit, stepping down as producer, and thus leaving a giant hole in Hammer Studios. Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed falls victim, though I think that isn't quite an accurate term, to Hammer's desperation to stay hip with the times, quote unquote. The swinging 60s had brought a change to Hollywood and thus the film industry as a whole. It rendered the gothic classiness of the late 50s and early 60s antiquated, a relic of a different time, if you were to kind of look at it. Now there was more sex, nudity, drugs, free love, violence, and a war going on. And all of those factors in which I just messaged played into many decisions made during the production of Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. So while some see it as Hammer being desperate and thus a departure from the normal formula for Frankenstein movies, I see it as mostly a blessing, with one notable exception. There is one big notable exception to this, which we will discuss later. Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed just seems faster. The pacing is not slow, but quick and full of an assortment of different scenarios. Most of this include Baron Frankenstein killing people in the name of his experiments. This is new, and I like that we're kind of returning to this. It's the first time we've seen this since Curse. This we see a lot more gore and violence in this movie, in part to compete with films like Bonnie and Clyde or the upcoming Wild Bunch. Yet in some ways, I'd say this is slasher-esque violence, which predates a lot of the violent exploitation fare popular throughout the 1970s, all within this movie. And this includes Frankenstein even wearing a creepy mask to hide his identity in the opening of the film. Dare I say this inspired the works of John Carpenter in any way, while he was working on Halloween? Probably not, but, I do know that he was indeed a fan of Hammer horror, so it could be. So it's just too bad that this movie doesn't get the credit that it deserves. Now, one way this movie gets away with this is the characterization of Baron Frankenstein himself. And one way, this is what kind of explains why this movie is the way it is. If the last movie showed him with a semblance of humanity, this film transforms him into a total monster. Frankenstein is a total asshole from beginning to end in this movie, murdering people for his experiments, blackmailing a poor couple just for trying to do the right thing, even if they are stealing narcotics for money. Said money is going to pay for the bills of one of their, I believe, Veronica Carlson's character, her mother. So it is a noble reason that they are doing this, and he deliberately misleads the wife of his quote-unquote creation, and most notably, he rapes someone in this film. And this goes back to what I mentioned earlier. This is the one misstep this movie makes, in my opinion, is the rape scene. The rape scene was added to add sex to what was a rather sexless movie to this point. It was Hammer's executive, James Carreras, who he just insisted upon the scene being added into the movie about halfway through production. Terrence Fisher, Peter Cushing, and Veronica Carlson all heavily protested this. They did not want to film this rape scene and thought that it just didn't work in the movie. It was never in the original script, and it is completely out of character for the cold, calculating Baron, whose only obsession to this point, and vice, is his devotion to his experiments, and the achievement of said experiments. But ultimately, the triad lost, and the scene was shot and used to promote the film heavily. Ironically, it all ended up backfiring, because when American censors thought even American censors thought this scene too much, and they removed the scene altogether. It is cut from the movie. Ironically, I prefer that version of the movie, though the rape scene remains intact on all home media prints I have found of the movie thus far. It's also, it's a very difficult scene to watch. It's a rape scene, of course it is, and I actually have difficulty watching any rape scene, but while this one is tame compared to some of the others I've seen, I think it's the screams of Veronica Carlson and the anger in which Peter Cushing does the act that for some reason makes this particular rape scene very unsettling to watch. And actually, most of the time when I watch the film, I skip it for this very reason. But other than that, other than this tacked-on rape scene, the aforementioned Baron being a total bastard is what completely sells this movie. It's completely what sells this movie. Peter Cushing plays the Baron with elegance and grace. Truly one of his best performances, if not my personal favorite Peter Cushing performance. How rapidly he can switch from charming to pure asshole to pure evil all in one scene and do it so naturally is truly commendable to Peter Cushing and the direction of Terence Fisher. But the thing that I think makes this movie truly great is the quote-unquote monster. 2 out of the 4 Frankenstein films thus far hadn't had a monster in it per se, but a person transformed into a metaphorical monster. Revenge was a man injured before he could heal, which turns him into a carnivorous madman. And in Frankenstein Created Woman, it is a woman torn by having 2 souls, and she is driven to murder. Once again, we now have a Frankenstein where the quote-unquote monster isn't a monster at all, but a regular human having fallen victim to the Baron's experiments. This is where Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed shines. Despite the very limited screen time, the character Professor Brandt and his wife are phenomenal. They steal the show, adding a deep humanity in a film utterly void of it, largely due to how horrible of a human being the Baron is. The creature played by Freddie Jones and his wife played by Maxine Audley are truly heartbreaking and adds a sense of tragedy rarely seen in these movies. Sure, Frankenstein Created Woman had this element in it as well, but it was more about the scenario than the characters themselves, in my humble opinion. After all, one of the characters we are supposed to feel sympathy for turns into a vengeful, puppeteering murderer. Not so here. Brandt doesn't hurt anyone. He doesn't seek to hurt anyone. All he wants is to see his wife again after having been driven to madness and unable to communicate for so long. Then Frankenstein fixes this madness via surgery and places his brain in another body for some reason. Meanwhile, Brandt's wife doesn't know any of this, and her shock is so genuine. It's a mixture of disbelief, shock, horror, slowly morphing into the realization that this stranger in her room right now is actually her husband. And she's traumatized having to see the body of her husband discarded in a crawl space with the top of his skull gone. is also missing his brain. That's a hell of an image. You know, she's had that, and now there's this stranger in this room who's claiming to be her husband. It's great shit. I love it. It's just good. You know, I wish I could play clips from it here. I really wish I could, because the scene where they reunite, the creature and his wife reunite, it is wonderful. Some of Anthony Nelson Key's best work, along with Terence Fisher's best direction as well. And considering these 2 actors are standing in the shadows of the Peter Cushing, I think stands a testament to the power of their acting chops. And the ending is perfect. The ending to this film is perfect. The 2 men hurt by Frankenstein the most seeking their revenge. And finally, Frankenstein himself is dragged into a burning inferno reminiscent of hell itself by his own creation. All the while, we hear him screaming bloody murder, crying for help where no one will give it. It is a fantastic and fitting end for Baron Frankenstein. And if this were the last of the series with Peter Cushing, I'd have been left happy and totally satisfied. This is a great movie, ladies and gentlemen. This is truly, truly a great movie. It had one big misstep, don't get me wrong, but other than that, I find this movie tight, concise, everything I want from a Hammer horror film. But unfortunately, it was all for naught, I'm afraid, because after this movie, Hammer would basically implode. And this movie failed miserably at the box office. Oops, I didn't mean to hit that button. My apologies. First off, this would be Anthony Nelson Key's final film with Hammer. He'd had enough and decided to walk away teaming up with Christopher Lee to form a wholly independent company of their own. Their main editor quit as well. Hammer's main editor quit as well after becoming exhausted editing Hammer's foray into television. Their primary set designer actually died. It seemed that Hammer, the Hammer of old, I should say, was just simply failing to keep up with modern cinematic trends, and finally was collapsing in upon itself. But they kept going, right? In large part thanks to Michael Carreras, who had quit Hammer earlier, but came back after his father, the founder of Hammer, wanted to sell the company off. Under the leadership of Michael Carreras, we'd see the dying days of Hammer Studio with just failure after failure after failure. Again, movies like Dracula AD 1972 and The Satanic Rites of Dracula, all feeling and appearing as desperate attempts at appealing to an audience who had moved on to bloodier, more violent forms of horror. I mean, let's look briefly at a movie that directly competed with Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. Night of the Living Dead. Frankenstein was in color and had plenty of red, bloody gore. Arguably, that was the most for a Hammer production at this time. Yet Night of the Living Dead was in black and white. And the movie was one of the most successful films of the year, despite it being made for utter peanuts. Why? Well, not only had the audience become younger, so had the filmmakers. And Night brought forward a whole new technique of independent filmmaking that would sweep and alter cinema forever. Comparing the look of movies like Last House on the Left or another Wes Craven film, The Hills Have Eyes, they make Hammer seem very, very, very antiquated. These were younger filmmakers with whole new ideas about how horror should look and feel. Terence Fisher, meanwhile, was of the older generation. The look of his films are just that, old. Great and revolutionary for their time, but by the 1970s, totally antiquated. And, you know, I hate using that term over and over again, but that's what it was. Hell, they even tried to reboot Frankenstein after Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, remaking Curse with Ralph Bates. They sexed up the story, they turned it into a black comedy, and it still had plenty of that Hammer gore. All in vain. All of it in vain. It was just a vain attempt to be hip. If you want me to really tell you what it kind of feels like Hammer at this time period, it feels like Dad using Gen Z lingo at a dinner table. The result is just kind of cringy, if not interesting. And all of this seemed to accumulate in 1974. Technically 1972, but who's really paying attention? By this time, Hammer was on its final leg, antiquation being the foremost thing on everyone's minds. And it seems like all those people, unable to keep pace, decided that they would go down with their ship. Instead of banking on another desperate attempt to stay hip, they would say, quote, once more, just like the old days. Fitting, they should choose a Frankenstein film to nearly bookend Hammer's 15-year-long hold on horror itself. That film would be Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. I have actually seen this movie the least out of all of Hammer's Frankenstein films, specifically the ones with Peter Cushing. I only saw this movie this year, actually, and I understand why fans of Hammer horror actually like it so much now that I finally see it. I enjoyed it quite a bit, despite one giant problem with the overall premise, kind of similar to the last film. As mentioned earlier, this film truly feels like Hammer closing not just a chapter of their company, but closing the book itself. This movie isn't overly sexed up. The gore isn't exploitative, but poignant to the plot. No funky or crazy soundtracks like we see with Dracula 1972 AD. You know, all those elements now popular within the Dracula series in general. It seems the producers decided to make one last classic Gother horror film, just like the old days. And it shows. This film is full of callbacks to the prior films, one being the famous shot of Peter Cushing looking through the magnifying glass, a shot parodied in the Zucker Brothers film's Top Secret. The film opens with a grave robber. There is a female lead, and she also is mute. We've seen that before. There is an up-and-coming scientist or doctor who wishes to work with Frankenstein. There's brain transplants. Frankenstein works in an asylum, though this time he is an inmate instead of just the doctor-physician. There's just a feeling over this whole movie and this whole production that this was it. This would be it. The final Frankenstein movie for Hammer, even though that was never actually the plan. To compare it to a movie that a lot of you guys in the audience might know, very similar to Terror of Mechagodzilla. While they didn't know this was going to be it, there's kind of a feeling that this might be it. And that's what happened here. Anthony Hines returned to pen a script for this, which I think helped elevate this movie considerably, was his handiwork. This would also be the last time Peter Cushing would play Frankenstein. And this would also be Terence Fisher's last movie, period, his previous film being nearly 3 years prior with Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. James Bernard would again make this brooding score here, and the combination of them all just sort of makes this movie feel like a kind of like a disturbing comfort movie in some ways of the franchise, because it's the gang's all here kind of deal. Now, Peter Cushing was 59 years old when this movie was shot in 1972, though the film wouldn't be released for another 2 years. Despite that pretty young age, it's just middle-aged in my opinion, he looks quite old and frail here. He looks rather sickly as well. And there is a big reason for this, and it wasn't because of the character. It was Cushing himself. The man was in very frail health at this time, and the reason is a very tragic one. In 1971, his wife Helen had passed away. Now, this wasn't like a normal, quote-unquote, Hollywood relationship. These two were utterly devoted to each other. Utterly devoted to each other. Cushing was known for his meticulous work on every character he ever played, and much of this was aided by Helen's hand. Indeed, on many scripts, famously marked up, all over the place, Cushing often would write her name in the margins. Why would he do this? Because he saw it as like a reminder of her importance in his life. But after her death, it reminded him to just keep going. And I mean, how romantic is that? Like, that's almost sickeningly romantic. You know what I'm saying? To better emphasize what I mean, I actually have a quote here. And here's what Cushing he had to say in an interview for the Radio Times. He said, quote, "Since Helen passed on, I can't find anything. The heart, quite simply, has gone out of everything. Time is interminable. The loneliness is almost unbearable, and the only thing that keeps me going is the knowledge that my dear Helen and I will be reunited again someday. To join Helen is my only ambition. You have my permission to publish that. Really, dear boy." I can hear him saying that. "It's just killing time. It's all just killing time. Please say that." On the night of her death, Cushing admitted in his autobiography that he tried to actually kill himself by inducing a heart attack. A hysterical response for sure, brought on by pure grief. But he credits a poem Helen had written prior to her death that he shouldn't die until he'd lived a full life. Cushing vowed to adhere to her wishes. So he worked himself ragged. He fell into a deep depression and just kept working. And I guess it was his good friend Christopher Lee who I guess got him kind of moving again in the immediate aftermath of Helen's death. I know I'm here to... Excuse me. Been talking for a little too long. I know I'm here to talk about the Frankenstein movies, and specifically Frankenstein the Monster from Hell, but please indulge me here just for a moment, if you would. Christopher Lee had been hired to work on a Spanish horror film called The Horror Express, and it was Lee who had Cushing join him as a co-star. He was worried for Cushing, and the two would have a good time making The Horror Express. They apparently even shared the same room. I've even seen some sources say they shared even the same bed, apparently. But this was enough to keep Cushing alive, essentially. A very touching story for a friendship that apparently began when the two were laughing so hard in a movie theater watching Looney Tunes, they had to be thrown out. You can even see Looney Tune characters throughout both of their houses whenever they do interviews, and much of them were gifts to one another. They were a total bromance. And quite frankly, Christopher Lee is the reason why Peter Cushing didn't just die then and there. But all of this took a massive toll on Peter Cushing, health-wise. He visibly had aged and had lost a lot of weight. So much so that in Dracula AD 1972, he was written originally to be the father of the leading actress, but it was hastily rewritten to be her grandfather. This comes across in Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. This is still a crass and evil Frankenstein, don't get me wrong, but the performance is much more subdued, but not jarringly so. Much of this is thanks to Anthony Hines tooling the script to better fit Peter Cushing's appearance. And like always, Cushing gives an amazing performance, stealing every scene. Most notably, a moment where he holds a knot with his teeth. A wonderful suggestion he made during the filming of said scene. One Terence Fisher thought brilliant. And despite a terrible wig, one dubbed by Cushing as, quote, the Helen Hayes hair, I agree. It's a downright brilliant performance. In fact, Cushing loved this movie and praised it several times in 1973 interviews prior to the film's release. He lauded being able to work with Terence Fisher again, too. And I think I think of all of those who directed Cushing, the partnership between he and Fisher could just simply not be topped. Apparently, real blood was also used on set, which I find interesting. Some taken by a blood bank who needed to get rid of some spoiled blood that couldn't be used with patients. It was notably used during the scene where Frankenstein and his assistant were assembling their creature. Speaking of blood, I love the gore in this film. It's tame, sure, but it's not so much so that I feel disappointed. It's tastefully executed. It's tasteful gore, especially at the end when the inmates of the asylum revolt and literally tear the monster apart limb from limb. And I mean that literally. They literally tear it. It's actually kind of shocking. They literally tear the monster apart and run around with his innards. Speaking of the creature, we actually get one in this movie. We get a creature here. And that leads me to my biggest issue with the movie. The monster itself. What the hell is that? What the hell is this thing? It is explained that the overall body came from a huge man that Cushing may or may not have killed, yet it looks like a balding Bigfoot. And this is supposed to be what Frankenstein calls the, quote, cumulation of his experiments? A perfect man brought back from death and capable of doing great feats? Yet it looks like a balding Bigfoot. Why? Whose decision was that? Who made that decision? It would have made much more sense if they made it look maybe handsome, or perhaps more like the previous creature in Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. I suppose they were going for this sort of Beauty and the Beast element, the beast falling for the mute innocent assistant and vowing to protect her in some ways. Sure, I can certainly see that, but play that up. And the movie does to an extent. It's just how the creature was made. It makes no sense why he looks this way. Why does he look like a balding Bigfoot or Bigfoot's ballsack? Now, as for the creature itself, David Prowse of Darth Vader fame played the creature, and I wish I could praise his performance here, but I just can't. I can't bring myself to do it because, well, I actually can't give much criticism one way or the other here because of how stiff the suit is. The mask doesn't move whatsoever, and his eyes are hidden most of the time by shadow. So we don't have something very similar to War of the Gargantuas, where the suits were made in much the same manner as the creature here. We just don't have that. But it's not like it's a bad performance per se. The physicality of the creature does deserve great praise, and there are moments where I like Prowse's physical acting, notably the scenes where he interacts with the mute girl. He does good with what he's able to do in that horrible monkey suit. Now, according to Prowse, it didn't take much time to dress for the role, which is surprising. This isn't like the previous creatures with meticulous makeup, or a lot of it. Instead, this is largely a balding ape suit with a cheap plastic mask. It took Prowse about a half hour to dress. That was it. Peter Cushing's co-star, Shane Brandt, I can't really remember how to pronounce his name. If you listen to the audio commentary for this movie, he could not hold his disdain in for the monster's overall design. He just hates it, and I hate it, so I kind of agree with them. But look, that's really my only big criticism with this movie, all right? If that's really my only big criticism with this movie, I feel like it's probably a good movie, and I feel that, you know. Unfortunately, though, I think this movie has a mild made-for-TV look to it, but I largely blame that on the open matte version I watched that came with the Blu-ray. Interesting aside, it seems like Hammer Films can't seem to decide on what aspect ratio they want to be. Case proven with the recent 4K restoration of The Curse of Frankenstein. Guys, just pick one. Jesus Christ. I don't need 6 different copies of the movie in different aspect ratios. Just pick one and stick with it, please. I don't care which one. Just pick it. Though I do have to say the amount of headroom in the open matte version of Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell is kind of comical at times. So, you know, that all being said, I did really like this movie. So do many Hammer horror film buffs. They all liked it, but unfortunately this film did absolutely miserably at the box office, ensuring Hammer would never release any more Frankenstein movies. Honestly, it's probably for the best, and I do admit that I find this film a wonderful bookend to Baron Frankenstein himself. Another movie would just ruin the magic we have here of his overall descent into madness, going from a youthful optimism, as Dark Corner Reviews would say, to stoic cynicism and madness itself. Frankenstein will never give up on his experiments, but he will forever be locked in his asylum until he does die. A fitting end for a monster. Now, with that all being said, we finally reached the conclusion of this. We can now come to the end of this lecture of sorts, and I'll conclude with something many film historians note. The Frankenstein series is the story of Hammer. Triumphant in the beginning, successful in its exploitation, but eventually outshined by a new generation of audiences and filmmakers. The dramaticist in me cannot help but see the poeticism there. A studio which rose with Frankenstein essentially fell with Frankenstein. Granted, we'd get several more films from Hammer until its liquidation in 1979, some of them great cult classics like Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter or Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, also starring Peter Cushing. But Hammer horror would finally end in 1976 with the film To the Devil a Daughter, a movie I have yet to see, but I really want to. Now, as a conclusion, I want to finish with this. Dark Corners Reviews, a channel I greatly respect and used as basically a guide to point me to further research, said of Frankenstein, quote, "These movies might not be art." I disagree. I think these films are art. They may not be overly sophisticated art, like a lot of artists would say, but it is art nonetheless. Art that was influential enough to rejuvenate horror and change it forever. And these movies deserve that credit and all the praise that they can get. I love Hammer's Frankenstein, and I always shall. They are sometimes clunky in execution, sometimes thought-provoking, sometimes funny, sometimes absurd, but they are always entertaining as hell. All right. I have rambled on enough, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to sit back, and I'm now going to open this up to the chat. I'll be here for a brief Q&A to answer any questions or just further discuss Hammer in general. If you've stayed this long and listened to me prattle on, I thank you for your time. I hope I didn't bore you too much. But I love these movies from the bottom of my heart. So one last time, I say thank you. And when we return, the floor is open. So ladies and gentlemen, we'll be right back.
Caught up in the evil of Frankenstein.
Get out of his way, you fool!
Go back and kill him.
Frankenstein. The name stands for fear. Frankenstein. He shocks the world as he mocks the devil. Frankenstein. He creates monsters of men. Frankenstein's most terrifying experiment comes to life. Frankenstein created woman.
Who am I? Who am I?
You see, the shield of indestructible matter. What is it for? What is it for? To give life after...
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Q&A portion of this, whatever little that there is. Prattling on for 2 hours, and the fact that, you know, this stream started an hour early, or hour late, I should say, probably going to end it a little bit early. Was happy to see that we had 10 viewers at some point, which is kind of surprising. I haven't really talked about Hammer that much before on this channel, though I have made a couple of videos, most notably a brief discussion about another Terrence Fisher movie with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee called The Gorgon, which I think was my first Hammer film I'd ever seen. Godzilla Kiru, quick question for somebody who has never watched Hammer films. Well, what the hell are you doing, man? You need to change that. What do you suggest one start with? The Frankenstein films, the Dracula films, etc. The best thing that you could do, I think, is watch Curse of Frankenstein and Horror of Dracula, which Horror of Dracula is a fucking masterpiece. It's so good. However, if you want a quick one, you can watch Revenge of Frankenstein right on YouTube. It's currently available here for free. Let's see. What's a good double feature? It kind of features it's kind of like a hammer firing on all thrusters. I think it's called The Devil Rides Out. Yes, The Devil Rides Out. If you watch The Brides of Dracula and The Devil's Rides Out, you'd be certainly seeing Terrence Fisher at his best if you watch those films. But I would recommend starting with Curse and Horror. Curse of Frankenstein, Horror of Dracula. Those are the staple two that you should start off with. Today is an important day in horror history, as today is Bela Lugosi's birthday. I posed that question to you. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but who do you prefer as Dracula? Lugosi or Lee? Mine is Lee, because of how fucking crazy he is. I love how much like a rabid dog that he looks. Well, Bela Lugosi's had like a lot of class and elegance to it. Christopher Lee managed to do both, and I think that's why he remains to be my favorite Dracula. even though I won't lie, I really enjoy Gary Oldman's take on Dracula in Bram Stoker's Dracula, the one directed by Francis Ford Coppola. I genuinely like that movie a lot, and I think it's kind of underrated, and I'm kind of glad to see audiences have kind of turning on it and starting to like it now. Okay, this is pretty creepy, honestly. When Halloween came out in 1978, Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Jeffrey Dahmer were all active serial killers. Well, yes, of course. The serial killer 70s. Yeah. Yeah. It is sort of interesting. I sort of talked about this earlier, but I think the slasher film, which became popular because of Halloween in 1978, I kind of joked about it, but in the opening of Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, Peter Cushing is wearing a mask, and he beheads a person, and then has to kill somebody in his lab because he gets caught, and then he has to dump the body, to try to hide it. The entire scene feels like a scene from a slasher movie. And the fact that Peter Cushing's character, Baron Frankenstein, is wearing a mask, I could not help but draw parallels to Michael Myers and some of the slasher movies from the 80s. So I sort of joked saying I wondered if John Carpenter maybe was influenced by it in some way. I doubt it. Maybe subconsciously, but I think that'd be just about it, quite frankly. Nothing really more. I do know that John Carpenter, though, is a fan of Hammer horror. He's noted several of those films, but in particular, Horror of Dracula is the one that he's talked about ad nauseum. So I just don't know. If you want a good werewolf movie, I think Hammer genuinely has the best werewolf movie I've ever seen. With Curse of the Werewolf with Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed gives a hell of a performance in that movie, and it is such a tragic film. It's almost comically tragic at times. And I also really like the werewolf makeup. It's not as iconic. It's nowhere near as iconic. Who am I kidding? As what we would see with Lon Chaney Jr. in The Wolfman, but it works. It works really well. And the ending of that movie in particular was really good. I guess Godzilla Kiru, if you want something else. The Mummy series. I mean, the Mummy series is very interesting with Hammer because they all are basically the same movie. They are all literally basically the same movie with the same plot. But yet, each film is so tonally and stylistically different from the other. They don't feel it. I mean, if you literally look at the stories on paper, they are the same movie. But when you sit down and actually analyze them and watch them, particularly with the acting, the actors, and the directorial style of each movie, very different. And it works. They work brilliantly. Curse of the Mummy's Tomb is genuinely my favorite mummy movie. While I think the Gorgon was my favorite, was my first Hammer movie, I think Curse of the Mummy may have actually been it. I'm not quite sure of the timeline in my history. I just know that Curse of the Mummy's Tomb was my first mummy movie, and I remember distinctly watching it because of the ending. I will always have the image of the mummy being crushed in the catacombs in my mind. I will always have it there. And having recently watched the Blu-ray version of the film, it's gorgeous. It's interestingly, that film was directed by Michael Carreras himself. He'd never directed a movie before, I don't think, and he directed that one. He does an outstanding job. It definitely has a very unique look to it, in part because it was shot also in Technoscope, which was a film process used mainly in Italy. But if you want some famous movies that were shot in Technoscope, Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy was shot in that process. But it was a widescreen aspect ratio, and it was certainly unique for Hammer, considering the fact that most of Hammer movies, too, both before and after it, were shot in the Academy ratio, with spherical lenses and stuff like that. So definitely a unique look. Dracula Prince of Darkness was also shot in Technoscope. Don't quote me on this, but I want to say that was one of only a couple of films that Terrence Fisher actually directed in, that super widescreen aspect ratio of roughly 2:35:1. He liked the spherical stuff. He liked the Academy ratio, and he tended to stick with that, which is kind of funny. Again, to kind of compare him back to Ishiro Honda. Ishiro Honda loved using the widescreen aspect ratio, or the anamorphic widescreen aspect ratio. Terrence Fisher just simply did not. It all depends on, what the filmmaker likes, I guess. But yeah. Good shit. Good shit. I've wanted to talk about Hammer for quite a while on here. I really have. And it being Halloween just kind of gave me an opportunity to do so. Especially with the shift in direction of this channel, where I'm no longer doing the stuff like I was doing with Antonio and stuff like that. The shift to a more history-orientated channel, this kind of was able to blend the two that I love so much. Yeah. Again, Godzilla Kiru, try to find Curse of Frankenstein, and try to find Horror of Dracula. And I think those are the two quintessential Hammer horror movies. By far, yeah. Yeah. Not that you really need to see Curse when you watch Revenge. If you just want to watch Revenge immediately and just put it on right now, even. It is on YouTube for free. It's also a great film. The sad part is it's just trapped between Curse being the first and the films that follow kind of outshining it in terms of flashiness and insanity. So, yeah, I feel kind of bad for it. It's the Godzilla Raids Again of Hammer. Dracula, the Dracula movies kind of went through something similar, but to a more extreme case, because Christopher Lee did not want to continue playing Dracula, so he wasn't in the sequel, Blood of Dracula, or The Brides of Dracula. That was it, The Brides of Dracula. I would argue Hammer's most beautiful looking movie is Brides of Dracula. It's just unfortunate that Christopher Lee isn't in the movie. If Christopher Lee could have been in the movie as Dracula, it would have been awesome. It would have been perfect. That being said, it is still a very great film. Looks great largely due to Jack Asher's cinematography. One of the best cinematographers ever, in my humble opinion. What he could create with nothing is nothing short of astonishing and great artistic work. Yeah. Also, Peter Cushing gives a great performance in that film as well. He is so good as Van Helsing. I think Peter Cushing is also my favorite Van Helsing. He's just so good. He's so good. You don't have to keep this on subject. We can talk about anything related to Halloween now, I guess. Doesn't really matter. I only plan on being on here for like another 5 minutes or so, because I'm exhausted and my voice is killing me. Well, I appreciate it. I can tell you one of my film history videos that I really, really, really kind of like want to do is I want to do a film called The Historical Context Behind Peter Jackson's King Kong. Which is a video I've wanted to do for quite a while. But just kind of going through, like, why is Engelhorn the way he is, why Hayes is the way he is, why the Venture makes sense as a ship, because it's made up of nothing but a bunch of dejected members of society. That kind of thing. I would kind of go into it and the impact of World War I on many of those characters within that film. I kind of wanted to kind of discuss that. I don't know how long the video would be made. I do have the script written for a video on War of the Gargantuas. I seem to have recently rediscovered my absolute admiration for that film because I watched it so much when I was younger. I kind of got sick of it. And only recently did I rewatch it and remembered how much I loved it and remembered why I used to call the movie the best kaiju film that isn't Godzilla. And I still stand by that. I still think it is the quintessential kaiju movie that isn't Godzilla. It is War of the Gargantuas. Also, its influence on pop culture is just absolutely cannot be ignored. But having rewatched the movie, I was like, oh yeah, this actually is a really great movie. So I wrote a script on, specifically, I think the video is I have a problem with War of the Gargantuas, and it is me tearing apart the international dub of the film, and why that is the most readily available version of the movie, not even in Japanese with English subtitles, that horrible international dub. And I go into the fact that the American version is a vastly superior dub, as well. And I go into the production, and, you know, it is a history video as well as kind of a brief review of and love letter of how much I love that film. Have you played the War of Rights zombie event? Yes, I have. If you go on to the Captain Adam YouTube channel, you will see that I played it once. I've only played it twice. And I have recorded it, and some shorts are coming out about it, but it's different. It's a lot of fun. It is. It's just I've discovered that people in the 4th of Jersey aren't too big of fans of it. I'm not the biggest fan of it. I'm not that big of a fan of what they've done with it. When they first did it 3 years ago, I thought the admins or the developers of War of Rights did a fantastic job. And it was a lot of fun because you could just go in with a couple of guys and kind of play it like Civil War COD zombies for a little while. And it was really fun. Some of the most fun I've had with the game. It is on YouTube and you can watch it. But it was me fucking around with, I believe, McCoy and Dracon. And we were just sort of shooting shit, laughing and killing zombies. And then it slowly grew into, we had a whole company of players from the 4th New Jersey coming in, and we were just shooting zombies. The unfortunately thing that the developers have done now is they've made it where you have to have like 800 people in the goddamn server just to hold off a horde, which I suppose maybe fits more in line with their, I see, this is why I can't completely complain about it. It kind of fits more in line with what they want to do with the game itself. I just miss the old days, and I wish they made the original game mode an option to play instead of just getting rid of it, because I fucking hate Titans. I hate those things. I think they're awful. And while I think this year fixed a lot of the problems that they did last year, I hated it last year. I was so mad last year at what they did with zombies. This year's is quite a bit better. I will say that. That being said, we still don't have horses in the game. We got Titan zombies. We had even an entire game mode. We had the 1776 game mode, but we still don't have horses for that game. Yeah, I'm a little pissed off at the developers. I will not lie. Oh yeah, Halloween is my favorite holiday. I don't care what anyone said. I really get into Christmas. Don't get me wrong. But I love October. It's a great month, and I love Halloween. I was talking with a bunch of my friends and I who used to be on this channel a lot. We got together, and we sometimes screen movies over Discord with each other, and we just kind of fool around and shoot the shit. And last night we watched Halloween 2. I'd never actually seen it before until then. And it was a very enjoyable experience, even though that movie's really dumb. But, you know, I was just kind of asking, like, how are you guys into spooky season? A lot of them said no. You know, usually because they're working so much and stuff like that. And I've been working my ass off too, don't get me wrong. But I have been making it a point to watch horror movies. Like I rewatched all of the Frankenstein movies from Universal and Hammer. kind of in prep for this because I didn't know if I wanted to go Universal or if I wanted to go Hammer, and I ultimately decided to go Hammer because I finally got my hands on Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, and I was very happy to complete my collection. But yeah, I've been watching some of those. I've been watching some of the Lucio Fulci films. I've been listening to a lot of soundtracks by Fabio Frizzi, one of the greatest horror film composers. And also Goblin of Dawn of the Dead fame. Who am I kidding? I am in the mood. I am in the mood for Halloween. I love it. Oh, to honor the Prince of Darkness, you'll be dressing as Ozzy. Awesome. Very sad to see him go. Very sad. Because that was like a kind of the death of that generation of metal was his death. I'm glad he got to go out with a bang and not a whimper. Because I won't lie, I'm not even a big fan of Ozzy. Not that I don't like his music. I respect his music. It's just not what I go out of my way to listen to. That concert was freaking awesome. That was freaking awesome. Yeah, as for the War of Right Zombie, it's only a limited time thing. I think the last day is Halloween itself, and then they'll make a patch and it'll go away. I'm okay with that. I actually think it's kind of cool that the developers only for War of Rights make these events happen, for about a month and then take them away. One, because it doesn't, it makes it so you don't lose sight of the original intent of the game, which was a Civil War first-person shooter, first and foremost. But also it kind of makes it feel a lot more like an event, like, oh, I have to play this month. And it's kind of exciting. Yeah, Dragonclaw 95 Halloween is the best. It's fucking awesome. It's awesome. The other day I went for a walk. Right? And I had my earbuds in. I was listening to the soundtrack to Zombie 2 by Fabio Frizzi, Lucio Fulci's film. I was listening to the soundtrack, and I was walking down the street, and the sun was just beginning to set, right? It wasn't completely down yet, but it was just starting to set. It was getting very close to golden hour. And the wind was blowing, and all the leaves that had fallen from the trees started blowing across in these great, beautiful patterns across the street. And I'm like, this is perfect. This is perfection. This is pure Halloween. And it was awesome. It was such a vibe. And I'm like, I just love it so much. I love this time of year so much. I also... Every October, have to watch Bravo's 100 Scariest Movie Moments, which is so surreal to watch, considering the fact that there's a lot of people that are interviewed in that they're dead. I think that came out in 2008, if I'm not wrong. But man, did that 100 Scariest Movie Moments shape my taste in horror, because so many films. I was introduced to so many films because of that, because the list on that series is so good, because it's not just of course they would put this on here. I mean, there are those, don't get me wrong, but it introduced me to Lucio Fulci, to Dario Argento, to a bunch of different horror films and genres that I didn't even know fucking existed until that series, especially a lot of classic stuff. And it really influenced me. It really, really, really influenced me. It's so good. And it's on YouTube. You can watch the whole thing on YouTube. Quality isn't the best, but I'm glad it's at least preserved there, because you can't seem to find it anywhere else. But every Halloween, I have to watch it. That, and I have to rewatch some of James Rolfe's Monster Madness as well. Oh yeah, the yard decorations are part of it. I love jack-o'-lanterns. I think jack-o'-lanterns are my favorite thing to do for decorations. I did have them. I had 2 outside, but unfortunately they rotted, so I need to make a couple more before, October ends. God, I love Halloween. I love Halloween so much. I love fall in general. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is 11:15 p.m. I am exhausted. My voice is killing me, so I'm going to go to bed. Thank y'all for tuning in. 2 hours and 15 minutes, roughly. Good stream. Good stream. Thank y'all for tuning in. Links to all my social media is, of course, in the description below. You can hit the subscribe button. That'd be of a great help. And the more you watch my videos, the more you hit the like button, the more you tune into my stuff, the more stuff like this can be produced. Again, I'm working a lot with Jonas Denif quite a bit on a lot of the Napoleonic War stuff, but there is some stuff that's coming out that's not just that. So do stay tuned, and everybody, fucking happy Halloween. Happy Halloween. Take care.
The Victor's wicked, insane?
Wicked, insane, evil. Call Frankenstein what you will.